Hi, and welcome to the 10th session in our series, Conversation Analysis and Healthcare Interactions. Today, we're going to take a look at storytelling. Before we get started, here are the articles that we'll use for today's session and the later live discussion. For the session, we're going to examine the topic of storytelling. By the end of the session, you should be able to understand how storytelling affects the normative organisation of turn-taking. You'll be able to describe some of the practices relating to how storytelling sequences are initiated, organised and closed. And you'll have an understanding of the responsibilities placed upon both the teller and the recipient of a story. Later, in the live session, you'll get the chance to discuss and address our key questions. And during the session, as ever, participation will always be welcome but will remain voluntary. Skipping your turn will always be a valid choice. And don't forget to have your PDFs open for this and the live session. Before we move on, let's take a quick look at what we covered in the last session. We examined the organisation of repair, a concept that we described as the problem solver in social interactions. We identified some of the ways repair sequences can be initiated and resolved, and we described some of the functions of repair sequences. Today, we're examining how storytelling sequences unfold in everyday and institutionalized interactions. A key reason why this session is scheduled at the end of the series is because stories tend to feature multiple core topics of conversation analysis. Topics such as turn design, turn taking, sequence organisation, preference, embodied actions, and repair all feature in the ways that people tell and receive stories. Now, stories are distinctive as they typically involve large chunks of extended turns at talk for the teller. However, these sequences are rarely performed as unilateral packages of talk. Instead, the action of telling a story assigns specific roles and responsibilities for both the teller and the recipient. As such, storytelling sequences can be seen as products of interaction as teller and recipient carefully coordinate their roles and responsibilities throughout these sequences. And stories are relatively well organised, unfolding sequentially with recognisable structures that can serve as a guide for participants. Stories typically entail a recognisable start, the purpose of the story, some background information, a recognisable conclusion, and a space for the story to be evaluated. Storytelling sequences are particularly interesting because they suspend the normative organisation of turn-taking in a conversation. That's not to say that turn-taking itself is suspended. Instead, it can be regarded as becoming differentially organised during these sequences. We've come to learn that turn-taking is well managed in everyday conversation. Typically, turns unfold one at a time, with each participant granted limited license to the conversational floor. Participants work to minimize gaps between turns and minimize overlapping talk. In stories, much of this system is placed on hold to grant the teller extended license to the conversational floor. However, stories remain interactive and do not unfold as a unilateral body of talk. Instead, stories unfold with a particular form of turn-taking between the teller and the recipient, where the rights and responsibilities each place affordances and constraints upon the types of turns they take during this sequence. The turns of the teller and the turns of the recipient become mutually influential. Introducing a story into a social interaction is an everyday activity, but successful accomplishment is not guaranteed. Telling a story, and moreover, telling a story well, is a complex activity with implications for both the teller and the recipient. These implications can be described in relation to Brown and Levinson's theory of positive and negative face, respectively, the desire for validation and the desire to be free from imposition. For a recipient, the implications relate mainly to the maintenance of negative face. Stories place an imposition upon a recipient to listen to an extended narrative, orient towards it, and take in sufficient information to produce appropriate responses as and when required. For the teller, the implications relate primarily to positive face. Telling a story presents an opportunity to be validated, both in being granted time to tell the story and to have their views validated. Likewise, if a participant blocks the telling or progress of a story, this represents a threat to the teller's positive face, as their story would be deemed as not worthy of being told. In everyday conversations, stories are accomplished interactionally among participants and can involve more than one teller. The ways that stories begin and unfold should be regarded as a situated practice, with the particulars contingent on the social and sequential context within which the story is told. And stories are not just told out of the blue. Stories usually serve a particular purpose that can be understood in both the narrative and the surrounding context of the story. And by necessity, stories are constructed with the recipient in mind, with key details selected and others omitted in order to construct particular actions for particular recipients. And in this, stories can also be co-constructed with tellers and recipient contributions having a mutual influence. Let's take a look at some of the responsibilities of the storyteller. First, the teller has to make it clear that they intend to tell a story and make it clear that this story is incoming. At this point, a good storyteller will orient the audience to the point of the story and offer an indication of the outcome, which will in turn offer an idea about the appropriate responses expected from the recipient upon story conclusion. In doing this, tellers must first secure the rights to pivot towards the storytelling role in the interaction. Once secured, they must narrate a coherent story, and some people do this better than others. The telling of a story may lack clear purpose, structure, it may get derailed with side stories, and it may just trail off without any concrete conclusion. If a story has been successfully narrated, the teller must also close the story in a manner that makes it clear that the story has reached its conclusion. And finally, the teller should work to secure the appropriate responses from the recipient. For the recipient, there are ongoing responsibilities during the telling of a story once they have given the go-ahead for the story to be told. The recipient becomes obliged to engage in extended listening, monitoring for key story indicators. And far from remaining silent, there is a normative requirement to respond at key stages in the story, both to acknowledge the key story points as well as to foster progression within the story. Recipients, however, are expected to hold off any substantial contributions that may impede or derail the progression of a story. And in this, the recipient must continuously attend to the teller's expectations, including the production of an appropriate response to the story's conclusion. When it comes to the telling of a story, the critical moment comes at the launch. The way that a story is launched has implications for the entire sequence, from the opening of the story to the ways that recipients respond to the story's conclusion. In this, there are two basic practices for the launching of a story, which are the form of an offer or a request. From first position, a teller can offer to tell a story, either implicitly or explicitly. And from second position, a recipient may request or invite a story to be told. Here is an example of a story launch sequence from first position. From first position, stories are typically constructed with a story preface, a prelude to the main narrative. In terms of interaction, these can serve as the first part of an adjacency pair, an offer-response sequence. This initiating action can project both the type of the story and the purpose it serves. It can also provide cues for the story's completion point and an indication of the appropriate responses expected. This short sequence contains all of these elements. In lines 1 and 2, we have the offer of a story, and built into this, we have an indication of the purpose of the story, and even a hint about how the story will end. On line 3, Hyla gains the go-ahead to tell the story. In this example, the story is launched from second position. Stories launched from second position are the result of an earlier request for the story to be told. This can also form the part of an adjacency pair sequence. In this example, the request for the story takes place in line 2, as Kurt's turn can be regarded as a freestanding solicitor of elaboration. Oh, really? From there, Phyllis immediately starts the narrative by offering some opening background detail. In the telling, how a story is told will shape the recipient's responses. The telling of a story constructs opportunity spaces for recipient responses which convey when and how the recipient should respond. The launch of a story projects the expectation of an extended narrative where the recipient will be expected to withhold substantial contributions or questions until the end. The storytelling will inform the type of story being told, its conclusion, and project the point where the telling sequence will close. And much of this can be found in the preface that, if performed well, will offer an indication of the preferred evaluations that the teller is looking to secure at the end of the story. Likewise, recipient responses can shape the unfolding story. Recipients don't just listen, they co-participate in the story. As the telling creates opportunity spaces for the recipient, the sequence affords the recipient several key points in the narrative where they can shape the unfolding story. At these points, the recipient can insert particular actions into the story. They can acknowledge the story in progress, they can encourage progression, they can solicit elaboration or request clarification. They may even express interim evaluations of an unfolding story in progress. In doing so, they can project their alignment with the process as well as their affiliation with the unfolding story. And as the story concludes, recipients are expected to offer some kind of response in order to evaluate the story and take a stance relative to the story's main point. When it comes to ending a story, there are a few ways that this can be accomplished. In a story's conclusion, it is important to remember that stories are told with a purpose. Some kind of action is usually accomplished in the telling of a story. The ending of the story is usually projected in the preface of the story, which is helpful for the recipient. And the ending of a story can be an upshot, a moral, or just an explicit closing of the story. However, in some instances, stories do not end well at all, and the tellers may just trail off into silence. In the telling of stories, there is usually some kind of purpose, and that typically involves the implementation of a social action. A story may be told in order to construct an account relating to a complaint. It may be a story shared to interact in what has been described as troubles talk, as teller and recipient work together to come to a shared understanding of their troubles. Stories may be told to offer advice or project a cautionary tale. They can also be told as a narrative account to justify a decision or to offer an account of past behaviour. This particular action is regularly evident in institutional settings such as courtrooms or healthcare settings. And with that in mind, we're going to take a brief look at our focus paper, the interactional production of a clinical fact in the case of autism. This paper examines an assessment of a child and the subsequent diagnostic process of the child who is being evaluated for autism. In the analysis, the paper identifies that the diagnosis is constructed over a series of storytelling sequences that unfold progressively across multiple stages. In these sequences, the clinician was seen to formulate, reformulate, transform, and negotiate their understanding of what they observed in the assessment. And in doing so, their narrative became crystallized and framed to make salient what they described as the child's lack of competencies. However, what became apparent was that in making these cases salient, they also elided the skills and competencies that were displayed by the child. We'll take a look at one of the excerpts as an example of this storytelling process. While this excerpt is evidently linked to a prior sequence, it still features distinct storytelling structures. Line 1 projects an incoming narrative with "the other thing is," before offering a glossed instance that projects their later report of the child's action as somehow unusual. The action of the child is constructed as a problem in this narrative. It is seen as out of keeping with the assessment process. On line 6, Molly orients to the story in progress. However, this turn only conveys alignment with the process and not necessarily affiliation with the narrative. Laura further characterizes the child in emotive terms, including getting frustrated, and introduces a diagnostically relevant construction of repetitive actions with kept digging. These narratives are more than just descriptions of events. These are recipient designed and action oriented. They are initial characterizations that are the basic building blocks upon which a later diagnosis can rest. The end of the story is projected on line 10 with "finally," after which Laura reports inaccurately that she told the child the cup wasn't real. This characterizes the child as incapable of telling the difference between real and pretend. And the self-repair on line 10 is telling. The move from "I said" to "well, you know, I told him." Laura did not in fact use the word "real" in the actual exchange, which can be found on page 63 of the article. And with that, here are the questions that we'll be addressing at the later live session. Thanks for watching.